Hello, hello, everybody. Are we are alive, and there we're going. Okay, now, so I'm Benjamin Jacobs. I'm the host of Wittenberg to Westphalia, which has absolutely nothing to do with STEM. And you are here at the STEM Roundtable, which is confusing. However, we've got a weird technical thing with Crowdcast where we can only host 4 people at a time. I'm here as the moderator and admin, so what we've done is we've got a Zoom chat going on, and I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the people you're actually here to see, and then we'll start the conversation. So I hope that sounds good. Is everybody ready on the Zoom chat? Good? Okay. You guys ready in the chat room on Crowdcast? You hearing me loud and clear and everything? I'm going to take that deafening silence as a yes. Okay. All right. There we go. All right. So let me share my screen. That screen. That is perfect. Okay. Let me just... Okay. So with me today we've got from the top left, we've got Chad Davies of the Scientific Odyssey podcast. Then we've got Raven Forrest Rascalzo of the Tiny Vampires podcast. We've got Teagan Phillips of the History and Philosophy of Physics podcast. Did I say that? I really should have written that down. Okay. Okay. Running a conference, my brain is like a sieve at this point. So Sam Hansen of the Relatively Prime podcast. And for everybody, they, them pronouns are preferred. And then we've got Raquel of the Tiny Vampires and Espanol podcast. Are we good? All right, so that's everybody. And we are here to talk about STEM topics and the hidden stories of STEM. Okay, so let me get my questions out here. I already have 2 monitors going, and I feel like I could use 3 more, but okay. Thank you. Oh, okay, this is a question before I start. On the Crowdcast, if someone could help me out here, are you guys hearing everybody on the Zoom chat? This was a thing that we weren't really sure about. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, we're not hearing sound? Okay, no. All right, so we're going to try and do this the clunky way. Yep, absolutely. I'm going to take off my headphones, point my mic at the speakers. All right, so can I get a sound check?
Check 1, 2.
Yep. All right, how's that?
Technology in the life of COVID.
There we go.
All right. Can people on the Crowdcast? Okay, my CM says it works. All right, that is great. I'll turn the speakers up a little bit, and we can get started. And if anybody is having trouble hearing, just let me know on the chat, and I will see it hopefully eventually, and I will do my best to remedy the situation. Okay. So let's kick us off. Which question do I want to start with? All right, let's start with number 1. So, all intellectual disciplines utilize jargon. But in the case of STEM disciplines, the language used can be extremely technical or even entirely mathematical in nature. Does this serve to hide the stories of different STEM disciplines from each other and from the public at large? Is this even a unique problem to STEM? So, who wants to start? Chad, I'll start with you.
So I think the thing that I would say is the answer is initially absolutely yeah. I mean, anytime, I think there's been quite a bit of work done on this. Anytime you use specialist language, you create an in group and an out group as part of that specialist language. And that language allows for really, really efficient communication in my discipline of physics. You know, oftentimes that language is very, very mathematical. And if you don't have the mathematical background to say, do, tensor theory, you're not going to be able to really dig down deep and just jump right into, say, Einstein's papers on the field equations in general relativity, or, the Dirac equation when talking about the quantum mechanics and then into quantum field theory, things of that nature. And so, yeah, that does absolutely create a barrier, which means I think that there's an imperative, both amongst the scientific community and then those wishing to interface with the scientific community, to have fluency both in the specialist language, but then also in trying to understand how to take that specialist language and move it into something that's much, much more accessible.
Raquel.
Well, I'm going to talk. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have to agree with Chad, but I would like to add also that even in between disciplines like biology and physics, there's also a barrier on that. And I think the jargon exists, yes, to understand each other in our fields. But since we're here as podcasters too, I think it's important for us scientists to do that to do that translation, because at the end of the question you say if it's even unique to STEM. I don't think it is. For example, if I try to read something from loss, like I get lost on that too, and I think it's present in different disciplines, but it's I think it's a big part from us, the experts, to try and take that jargon and make it into something that the general public can understand. And I think that's missing a lot. But we're trying and we're beginning on this. So that's my opinion, of course.
Yeah. Well, of course. Yeah.
I'll jump in as the math person here. There's math jargon I don't know quite a bit of it. I still to this day, I always bring up K theory. I don't know what K theory is. Why is it just called K theory? Why not, KLW theory? It makes no sense to me. But sort of going beyond that, I think that, yes, it does create in and out groups. I also think that that's sort of jargon's purpose. I think it's done on purpose. I do think that there is, sort of from a culture within sciences, culture within any actually expert topic, where you are actually trying to not include everybody, because including everybody in its own sort of way makes it less special. Now, I'm not saying that this is a true thing, but I'm saying that there is a sort of drive to sort of make in and out groups in order to preserve sort of your own place. It's not, if you are a mathematician, you actually want those physicists to come up and ask you what is going on. You don't necessarily want them to be able to get it all on their own, otherwise they wouldn't need you. Once again, this is not something I think people are necessarily doing consciously, but I do think that this is an important thing. I think it is one of the big reasons that jargon exists.
Raven?
Yeah, I think it's hard to, especially as a science podcaster, it's hard to decide when to include jargon and when to leave it out. If you leave it out completely, then you're not really enabling the community to branch into your field. But if you include too much of it, you're basically, like Sam was saying, kind of intentionally excluding them, even if you don't realize it. When I'm writing for Tiny Vampires, I often will, basically it's a form of trusting your audience to say, okay, I'm gonna give this word and I'm gonna give some context for it, and count on them to make some logical leaps, not very big leaps, but some logical leaps to figure out on their own what it means. And then, when they're hearing these words in the news, especially with biology and disease right now, people are hearing a lot of it. Then they feel more included. They know that they understand something, and I think that's part of what we're trying to do as science communicators.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with all of the points everyone else has said. I just want to add one little point. Part of the reason I think why a lot of the jargon and the kind of mass speak that's present in various STEM fields, why it's maybe a bit more of an issue than in some other fields, is also part of the education that we get and the training that you get in a STEM field versus something in like the humanities or the social sciences. If you study some of the other fields, then there's a lot more emphasis put on writing and on being able to express your ideas, explain your ideas, instead of in STEM, where it's more useful if you're going into a certain field to be able to calculate the equations. You don't necessarily have to be able to explain them to somebody who doesn't know. That's a very, very useful thing to do, especially when it comes to the time when you are working and you need to be able to explain things either to other people in other fields or to the general public, to explain like why what you're doing is useful and what it's actually for, especially if you want funding. That's a very useful thing to be able to do, but there's not very much of an emphasis put on that within education, within a university program, typically. There are some courses available, but a lot of times they're just elective courses and aimed more at people who want to go into teaching.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that some other fields, whether it's like English or any other field, almost, have a lot more of an emphasis put on being able to, that communication aspect.
I really think that's a great point, and I actually want to contradict I was very, very down on jargon before. I now want to speak out for jargon, just the tiniest bit. Some of that made me think about some of what Raven said, in particular, the idea of like not taking out all of it. So the one time that I was commissioned to do a radio piece, I had an editor who worked with me wonderfully. It was a really good experience. And then in order for the piece to get through, it had to go to one more editor up. And that editor seemed to have a complete fear of any word that had anything to do with mathematics whatsoever. Like to the point where they tried to make me drag out the word number system. This piece was about quaternions, which are literally a number system. And so there is some, is from some of the gatekeepers who exists in the audio realm, there is some sort of bonus fear about some of this jargon that sometimes will not let it through. I will say math tends to be targeted a little bit more because they will let people say DNA on the air. I feel number systems and DNA are about equivalent. They both build things. And so I do think that we also have to, as Raven was suggesting, we have to be willing to accept that our audiences are smart enough to sort of understand, and at the very least, go look things up.
How much of this do you think is, and I'm stepping on the toes of a later session, which Chad's going to be in, but how much of this do you think is down to the history of the disciplines? Like you mentioned K-theory, Sam. Presumably someone invented that and they had a reason for calling it that. And, so how much of this do you think this is just the history of the discipline that then people don't learn, and so they don't know what's important to keep and what's something you need? I don't know if that's an intelligent question. I could ask a question that you're all actually prepared for, if you'd like.
I know I can speak to that a little bit. I know that there's more and more women are joining biology, and people of color, and they're really interested in why we use the words that we use for things. A lot of biological terms are starting to be, like, the names for them are actually starting to be changed, because a lot of times the people who it's named after, the people who discovered it, who are typically white men who had an army of minorities working for them, who actually made the discovery. And it's just that the white man was the one who was leading the lab, and so they were the ones that got to name everything after themselves, even though they didn't do any of the work. So so as we include a more diverse group, I think they're very interested in understanding the history behind the jargon and, where appropriate, changing it.
If I can add something to that too, I'm going to speak specifically from the discipline of physics historically. Is I think sometimes the language is also what I would call, and maybe this is too jargony, but what I would say is model dependent. And I think probably the best example of that you might give, that comes to mind, at least right off the top of my head, is when we talk about what happens when we have electricity in a wire. That model, going back into the 18th century, the early models of that were that electricity was a fluid. The fluid would move through the wire much like water moves through a hose. And so when we decide we're going to name the quantity of that electricity moving through the wire, we use a fluid term, one that you would take from water moving down the channel of a river, and we call it current.
Right.
And it turns out, of course, that as we move to a deeper and better understanding of the nature of matter and how all of that works, it's electrons moving through a conductor is the model now. We don't think of it as a fluid traveling through a wire like water through a hose, but you still have that terminology. When I teach my physics students every semester, we talk about, electric current, as if, we actually model by analogy in saying that one of the ways, since you can't actually see these tiny little electrons moving through the crystal matrix of the conductor and all of the things that are going on, we just sort of shortcut all of that to saying, hey, we can use a water or fluid analogy, much like the folks in the 18th century did. And so I think some terminology and some jargon, which can be misleading, is historically dependent. It's based on the original models or early models to try to describe a physical phenomenon, and the terminology just sticks around.
So let's move on to the second question, because I think that's related to where we're going with this. Humans tend to think in terms of narratives, but in many ways, STEM disciplines do not. This has left STEM disciplines vulnerable to manipulation of their has this left STEM disciplines vulnerable to manipulation of their narratives by outside forces? Has it prevented STEM disciplines from being as inclusive as they should be? Let's start with Teagan this time.
Yeah. So I think I was thinking about this question yesterday. I feel like in principle, it seems to me like it should make STEM disciplines more inclusive, because you take away some of the idea of like, oh, well, these are the people who are studying STEM. In theory, and it should be presented just as like, these are the equations, this is the theory, and it doesn't matter who you are, who they were, who came up with it. These are kind of the things that you can learn, and then you can take it and you can do various different things with it, whether it's building or designing things in engineering, or going and calculating, making proofs in mathematics, or coming up with different theories in other different sciences, and that kind of thing. I think in practice, that is not the case. And it definitely has, I think, led to more a sense of exclusivity, because you have taken away some of the stories. The people who were involved, who have been involved from various different backgrounds, who are currently involved as well. and you're left with like these are the kind of things, the topics within the fields or the equations or whatever. But then you also, on the other hand, start hearing things like there's all this bias present, there's discrimination from all the different other aspects of the STEM fields, whether it's awards, funding, societies, who gets various positions in academies and universities. All of that then gets publicized, and that's very fairly prevalent in the news. And so you end up with stories that are sort of much more exclusive, like people are being deliberately excluded from the STEM fields, and you aren't being told the stories of all the various diverse people who are working in the fields, not as much when it's being presented to you when you're first learning it. So I think that kind of combination has probably done some more damage than perhaps it could otherwise have been done. Yeah.
I don't actually think that we remove narrative from STEM.
Okay.
We just limit the narratives that we tell. There is a narrative about scientists. Scientists are lone geniuses. They're white male, white men, lone geniuses that do all of the work completely by themselves. And then they are the experts and you should listen to them. And this is an incredibly damaging narrative for a bunch of different reasons. One, it completely removes the actual identities of the people who do science and mathematics. It removes all of the other labor that is being done by people who are not just the one named person. And it also creates a completely unrealistic expectation of the intelligence of scientists. And there's one, I recently heard a story about how this lone genius theory is actually causing problems during the COVID-19 pandemic. It's one of the reasons that people are willing to accept misinformation studies.
Yeah.
Because they think, oh, a doctor said this. And doctors are these geniuses, they're these lone geniuses that do things without thinking like, oh, so that's just like an obstetrician randomly writing about pandemic research? That doesn't make any sense. Like that, they're not actually an expert. Like, I mean, I might as well be writing about it. Like I have some statistical background at least. And a lot of med students have maybe taken one class. And that's not to say that they are not incredibly well trained and good at what they're trained to do. It's just I definitely should not, deliver a baby. That would be terrible. And so I think sort of that lone genius thing, and also we tell a lot of stories about, say, the people in the history, but we only tell the ones that the culture of the discipline accepts, and that does also remove just a huge amount of people who are doing the work.
So on a technical note, the Zoom call says it's going to end in 10 minutes, which would cut us short by quite a bit. So let's take an intermission because now's about the time where we should move over to the Q&A. I'm going to send a new Zoom link to everybody in the email chain if you've got that open. Same place you found this one, pretty much. And we'll restart the call. Does that sound good?
Sure.
All right. On the Crowdcast side, we'll be back in 2 minutes or 1 minute, whatever. And you can still see my face, which is, a wonderful thing on its own. How you guys doing today? Why is this not working? Oh, right. This thing's over there. Okay. Doctor on TV, that's really nice. Okay, where were we? I have far too many things open now. Nope. Teagan, go. Okay, link is sent. Two, three, 4.
And we're back.
Yes, we're missing. Yep, there we go. Okay. Just connecting to audio. And we're good. Okay. Thank you for your patience, everybody. A nice little conversation sparked up in the chat, which is awesome. But let's start off with, we have one person who asked a question. So let's see, that's Gregory Murray in the question box asked, does the use of jargon assist with the passing of ideas to different cultures by avoiding the language barrier, or does each culture/language have its own vocabulary?
I think a lot of that depends on what's happening in terms of whether there's some sort of a shared understanding of the jargon between those cultures, right? There's got to be, you know, if I talk about fields in physics and somebody in biology wants to engage with that, they've got to understand what a field is, right? And they've got to have some background, which, you know, maybe in their education they took an introductory physics class, and maybe they got lucky enough to have a physics educator who was able to sit down and really explain what the idea of a field was and how it works and why physicists use them and all of that. But if we don't have that, right, then things get a little tougher. And this is where I think sometimes mathematics can be a real help, in that mathematics tends to be, I would say, a little less culture specific or culture dependent. And so, you know, you can sit down and work around the shared ideas in the mathematics, because mathematics tends to be pretty universal. But, you know, it requires that there's got to be at least some shared knowledge, or some shared knowledge or some shared language across those various cultures.
I feel like, Raquel, I need to...
Yeah, can you repeat it just before I say something?
Sure.
I want to make sure I understand.
So, does the use of jargon assist with passing of ideas to different cultures by avoiding the language barrier, or does each culture/language have its own vocabulary?
Yeah, I think we have been talking about history and how science has led to what we see today, and I think it's really hard to say that each culture has its own language because science is in English. So in part, the jargon does help in everywhere you are, because we all can communicate with English language. And if you understand those common concepts, then you're able to communicate. What I would say, though, maybe not in understanding, but
Raquel, you cut out there a little bit.
Way different cultural languages are different, and Raquel, you can come up with different questions.
You cut out about a minute ago. Can you? I'm sorry.
Right. I don't know where I left off. I'm just saying that in terms of understanding, the jargon is helpful, but I think there's a lot to be offered from the different cultures and the different understanding we have. to science in that way. I don't know if I'm making myself clear.
Yeah.
So it does help, but I like the different cultures and different upbringings, bringing down those different point of views in how we make questions and how we do research in different fields.
Sam, I think I need to throw it to you about mathematics, but really quickly before I do, just a little bit of interesting anecdote in this area. When European Latin-speaking scholars started bringing Greek philosophy, which ended up, kicking off all sorts of interesting intellectual developments, a lot of times they had no word for the Greek concepts that they were bringing in, so they would just transliterate the word straight in, and then that would lead to decades upon decades of arguments between Latin scholars about what that word means, and arguably they never got it right, according to modern philosophers. But so Sam, the idea of mathematics as an international language.
Mathematics is a part of Western European colonialism. It assumes that there is a single way of knowing. It assumes that everyone is now speaking a single language. We have the same transliteration problem. Hey, how many people know that algorithm's actually a weird transliteration of the name of the Arabic person who actually invented algebra? These are parts of what happens with mathematics, and the sort of false assumption that mathematics should be this universal transcultural language. You can only have a universal language if every culture that speaks that language gets to have a say in what makes up that language. And so I really think that some of these, it is a form of Western European colonialism, which is it's something that I've had to come to grips with over the last few years when I started reading more about things like ethnomathematics and sort of how mathematics is constructed. And it's something, as mathematics feeds into all of these other subjects, that it also perpetuates.
Mm-hmm. So we've got a whole bunch of questions and conversation going on now, and that's amazing. And we only have 5 minutes left, so I'm trying to cut through to the key stuff. Man, there's so much good stuff going on. But so Thomas Goodwin asked, more observation than question. I think the great man of history narrative is also damaging because it fails to explain how the scientific process, particularly peer review and replicating experiments, actually works to the general public. And I think that feeds into some of what we were saying before about the myth of the lone scientist. Anyone want to comment on that?
Just a kind of a statement of agreement, and just it's part of you ask the question is because STEM oftentimes doesn't always have a really strong narrative, or doesn't tell a strong narrative about its work, doesn't promote that what happens in science can get hijacked, and I think this is a case where that's very much what's happened. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting, and there's been a lot of work on this, what you might call, indigenous science or practical science, those kinds of things, whether that be practical medicine in the medieval period, before you get sort of some of the things that happened during the Renaissance, or, I did an episode on metallurgy, which metallurgy is entirely practical science, or what Aristotle would have called techne. All of that, is doesn't feed into a great man narrative, because it's the science that arises out of the collective work of people just doing the day-to-day things of trying to figure out the world around them and get through that world around them in the most effective and survivable, if you want to say, way possible. And all of that was neglected for I would say a couple of centuries of history of science. And only now is sort of really being, mined. And as that information is being sort of rediscovered, as it were, we're really beginning to find out that, ideas about a specific single scientific revolution, put forward by a couple of really brilliant individuals in each field or something like that. That's really a profound oversimplification of the process that led to sort of the emergence of a great deal of what we would think of as scientific knowledge out of these practical practitioners of various fields.
Yeah. So I think we got time for one or two more questions. We've got, do you think jargon in textbooks functions as a gatekeeper by intimidating those trying to learn a new subject?
I think we it's kind of a form of like I'm a veteran, so it's like it kind of feels like basic training, where you're kind of painfully forcing people into a way of thinking that eventually kind of makes them part of an organization or part of a group that can speak to each other hypothetically smoothly. So I think in to a certain extent it's like we all have to learn this language because you can't talk to each other smoothly. I can't explain the entire system of the Krebs cycle when Raquel and I are talking about mosquitoes. It's like you got to skip that step, and that's what jargon is for. But it can be incredibly intimidating, and especially like I have a learning disability, and Raquel is as English is a second language, and so it can cause problems because you're already trying to overcome a barrier, and then you have to jump yet another hurdle, and I'm not really sure how to fix that to make those sorts of things more inclusive.
I want to add something real quick on that note. I think, like I said in the beginning, I think we have a lot of responsibility to educate the public on that sense. But if you're going to start learning by yourself, you also have to, there's some jargon that you just need to learn, and you just have to look it up. And like Raven was saying, English as a second language. It is, I spend a lot of my time just translating a word, but a lot of if you want to learn it, I think it's also, there's a lot in your responsibility to look for those things and learn them by yourself, because it does create the exclusion, but you need the jargon anyway. So.
All right, and on that note, we are at time. So this has been great, guys. This has been fantastic. A great conversation, really great questions from everybody in the chat. This went really well for the first session and we're using weird technology and all sorts of snafus. So this went really smoothly, and I'd like to thank you all for making the time to come to the round table, and for the listeners or the viewers out there, thanks so much for participating. And we are going to, and I should just say for everyone's edification, this has been recorded, it will be saved, and the video is going to start to be available to everyone with a ticket at some point in the short-term future. So you can all look forward to that, and if you missed any sessions at this time slot that you also wanted to see and you're feeling sad about it, they're recording it too. So thanks everybody, and see you later.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.